Last week, I talked about how financial conditions are tighter than people think. Today, I want to talk about follow on to that. But yesterday, uh, New York Fed President John Williams spoke, and he said from the Fed's perspective, there's two things they're still worried about. Inflation is still running too hot, and they need to bring it down. And in order to do that, unemployment's going to have to come up. So he's expecting inflation by the end of this year to be between 5 and 5.3%, and next year going to 3 to 3.5%, with unemployment moving up by the end of next year to 4.5 to 5%. So pretty significant changes there. We have inflation running, and it's still a problem with the war. Food, energy, and labor costs are still high, and the labor market is still quite tight. But there are conditions changing very rapidly. And I think we have a lot of economies going on at once that's making it very confusing for all of us to figure out how to play this environment. But we have some very conflicting numbers coming out at us. And I want to go through some of these because it speaks to, I think, the way the US may come out of this better than everyone else. And how we do will depend on how bad it gets in the rest of the world. And I think Europe and China are in a bad spot right now. I think they'll continue to be. I think the odds of a recession are quite high for those economies. I think the question on the US is how fast can we manage through this, bringing business back to the US from overseas? And how do we do in terms of putting the money to work from all the stimulus that we've put out? But we are getting some tailwinds, and I want to show you what the tailwinds look like. So starting with globally, this is a big change, and WTI is down 37% in just 6 months. So we've had a very significant change in the price of oil very quickly, which also we've seen a pretty quick drop in the 10-year Treasury of 50 basis points since in a month. So very quick move in treasuries as well, which naturally leads to an easing of the US dollar, which had been too hot, which is actually a very good positive for US multinational companies. And that is creating some really opportunities for taking pressure off the global system as well, because we've been putting a lot of strain on the global system with the strength of the dollar, and that's making changes. Housing in the US has been a big area of inflation. And here's an example of rents year over year starting to come down. And that's a big part of it. And this is one of the slowest things to move. And as you know, we've had mortgage rates move up from 3% to over 7%, and then back down into the mid 6s. That change has put the brakes on the housing market, which is very important to the US, but it's important all over. But you are starting to see rents come in and affordability pick up, which is going to be very important as we move into the future economy with more layoffs. You need more affordable rent, because I think that as you have more layoffs, you have less wage pressures, less employment costs, and that's going to moderate some of the challenges for companies. And for consumers, the lower rents are going to be important. Here's 11 major metro areas where they saw a change pretty significant. You're seeing Milwaukee, Minneapolis. So you're seeing the changes here. This is actually going to help offset some of the problems that consumers are facing. And adding to that, gas prices being down $2 at the pump since July is a big change for the US consumer, and it puts a lot of money in their pockets as they move forward. So I think there are some positives for the US going against the negatives of the rest of the world that are easing the conditions that we have, even though in other areas we're seeing tightness like the housing market, and you're seeing the impact on that. But it's making things, it's starting to put some of the distortions that have gone on over the last couple of years are getting more normalized, I think, and we're starting to move into what the real future economy is going to look like. So where does that leave us? I think Powell is going to be speaking this week. His message is about the labor market still being too tight, that we are going to continue to have wage pressures. We have big negotiations with the railroad workers. We have negotiations going on around the world for labor costs. That's one of the big areas. But the other message for Powell is that the Fed and the market are out of sync. The Fed has us having 2 rate cuts next year. The market has us having 2 rate cuts next year. The Fed is not anticipating that. The Fed believes they need to kill inflation once and for all and do it one time, not do it multiple times like we did in the 70s, where it didn't work and is more expensive and creates more distortions. So they want to bring the market back into line with them, which is that they're not going to work to bring rates down below where they are right now, I don't believe, unless there's a big financial crisis next year. And the reason for that is they need to kill inflation here, but they also have to be mindful of the rest of the global economy, because our inflation is everyone else's inflation too, particularly around energy and food. So we need to get the global economy, which is weakening under the strains. We need to provide a little bit better supports. The dollar easing provides better support for that. But the food and energy prices coming down provide better support too. But we have 2 big wild cards right now. China being the big one, I think, both from what are they doing with Taiwan and what are they doing internally with their own economy. They're struggling right now with COVID. They're seeing a massive outflow of the wealthy leaving because they're concerned about what the future looks like there. So a lot of billionaires who wanted to leave have already left. You're seeing capital outflows. And again, you're seeing some real challenges for businesses working under this current regime and where the Xi is going with his new elements of it. So I think China has some real issues, and that's not counting their COVID issue, which continues to go on. So for us, I think we're still in one of those modes where the market is still sorting out its issues. We haven't peaked in inflation yet, but we're getting closer to it in the US, which is going to allow firmer footing for the markets. But I think we need to get to a point where unemployment starts to worsen, and we need to see that happen to get the markets more aligned with where the Fed needs to be. And then over time, I think into 24, you should see rates come down, not counting whether we have a major financial crisis or not. I've talked about financial crises coming when the Fed raises rates. I'm wondering if we haven't seen them already with what we've seen in SPACs, what we've seen in the NASDAQ, what we've seen in crypto, what we've seen in other areas. Has a lot of the froth come out of the market already? And are we moving with some of the excesses being put to the side and positioning ourselves to start moving back to a better growth? So Mark, with that, I'm going to stop and open up for discussion.
So questions, comments?
Yeah, sure, Stephen, I've got a quick question. So I thought it was a really interesting point that you raised about how the market and the Fed are sort of out of sync and sort of moving together, I guess, or not at least viewing the future path of rates the same. So if the market thinks the Fed's going to cut next year and the Fed thinks it's going to either remain flat or increase rates next year, that disconnect, I mean, I guess my first question is, why invest now? Why is now a good time to be investing in the market? And is it, or shouldn't people be dollar cost averaging if there is this disconnect to sort of capture that bottom without trying to time the market? What are your thoughts there?
I think you need to be doing both. I think there are opportunities to buy stuff in the market today because valuations have come down a lot. And I think we're having a series of rolling recessions hitting different areas of the economy at different times, creating big opportunities in certain areas, like the US steel industry for one. Other areas you can pick up where there are nice opportunities to make money in this environment. Energy is still going to be a place you can make money, both on the renewables and also on the fossil fuel side, because they're both going to be important for the longer term. So I think there are opportunities to do that. I think because of the uncertainty that's out there, you want to be allocating capital quarterly, because over the next 6 to 9 months, we're going to be getting to a better place, I think, in the global economy and in the US economy, certainly. I think the US is going to continue to attract a lot of capital away from the rest of the world. I think the challenges of China are pushing stuff to the US. I think a lot of industry is moving to the US. I heard from Nancy Lazar this morning that by their count, over 500 companies have reshored to the US in the last 12 to 24 months. Most of them out of China, but more and more you're seeing industry out of Europe moving to the US because of the lower cost of energy. So I think there are a number of factors that are putting the US in a pretty good spot. I think you really want to be careful investing in China right now. I think it's a trader's game. If you're going to play there, it's not a long game. But there are opportunities throughout. I think China does present some opportunities, particularly if you invest in their national champions. If you want to invest in businesses outside of that are going into China, look for companies that are not in the that don't have national champions in their industry. You don't want to compete with China's national champions if you want to succeed in their country. I think, Joe, that's how I would look at it.
Thank you.
Other
I do
comments,
think one of the
questions?
big mistakes people are going to make is waiting for everything to be clear to start investing. And I've recommended to several families that who are waiting to start putting either 1/6 or 1/4 of what they want to put to work now.
Yeah, and to that point, Stephen, one second key is we're doing this asset allocation survey, and I'll ask Vanessa to put it back in, where we get everyone sort of weighing in on that comment. We didn't ask that question specifically. We probably should have, Bill, as I think about it. We did ask public or private, but we'll put it into the Zoom. We've already got in 48 hours about 30, 40 responses, so we want to keep that pace going. Keith.
Stephen, quick question. You mentioned flows of capital into the U.S. on the investment basis. What are your thoughts on the strength of the dollar and the foreign currency exchange? And how is that going to cause the capital to flow more quickly, or ebb and flow, or what? You think people are going to wait for rates to shift?
I think as the Fed gets closer to peak rates, which they'll probably raise 1 or 2 more times, maybe 3 more times, but maybe 50, 25, 25, something like that. I think that as we start to slow down our rate increases and stop our rate increases, that actually will take some of the strength away from the dollar and make other currencies more competitive, particularly if Europe keeps tightening. So I think the dollar is probably peaked for the near term and should start easing, which should take some pressure off the global system and help the global economy. I think that will make it easier for foreign dollars to come into the US too, because it's less expensive.
Got it. Got to get the new norm set, I guess.
Yeah, well, we're going to see a lot of crazy flows because I think the global economy is going to be pretty herky-jerky with headline news, whether it's Russia or China or the like. And then, we've had the protests, and Hamlet's going to talk about Iran in a minute. But I think that's one of the other issues is the social unrest that's going on is a wild card going into next year.
Yeah, Stephen, you brought up an important point, and that was the manufacturing flight from China. If you think and if you believe that the Chinese real estate market was propped up and not based on sound numbers, and you question the Chinese economy and GDP growth in general, if this manufacturing flight out of China is real, which obviously it appears it is, those are real jobs that are leaving mainland China, and that I think is going to add to the tensions and the issues that Xi has at home. So if I was a betting man, I would say some of the scenes we're seeing coming out of China right now is probably the beginning, not the end of a rising voice in mainland China.
Which makes where companies invest who are in China really thinking about their plans for how do I manage my business down, particularly if they're competing with Chinese national champions, they have no shot. If they're in a business that the Chinese don't really care about, like fried chicken, that's a whole different issue. You can look at some of the industries that you want to invest in China because they are going to be a big consumer market. You just want to be protecting yourself from competing against Chinese companies in China. And I think this actually will call into question whether how China handles COVID, which I don't think they're handling it very well. I think calls into question whether they will overtake the US as the largest economy, which is an interesting kind of view because most people believe it's a foregone conclusion. I'm not sure it is. We also thought it was a foregone conclusion that Japan was going to keep going in the 80s too.
Yeah, it's an interesting I'm sorry. It's an interesting question because the plan was to move China to a much more consumer-oriented economy. And so, which is, I mean, that was policy like just a few years ago. And it's interesting to see Xi's response to all this, and especially the COVID policy. And, is he killing the goose that he's counting on to lay the golden eggs, for China?
It's interesting you say that, Bill, because I heard this Sawcroft group speak a little while ago, and they were saying that one of the concerns is just that the flight of capital and the flight of skills out of the country is quite high, and what's left is their lower quality workers. And if we start having a brain drain from China, from Chinese nationals, as well as from foreign companies coming in, that actually sets them back considerably. And I think that's a big challenge that they're looking at right now.
Yeah.
Hey, Steve, is the primary destination for all of that, all those exits from China to the United States, or are there other countries that are?
No, Europe's getting their piece too, and some of it's going to other areas, lower cost areas in Europe, in Asia as well. So we're moving around. You'll always find capital flows to the highest return. So that's what they're seeking out. So they'll go wherever the highest return is going to be. For many, it's going to be in the US because it's closer to their biggest consumer market. If China's their biggest consumer market, they'll figure out what they need to do there. Same thing with Europe.
Yep.
The system is very reflexive. And I think what we're seeing right now is a condensing of the flows of capital and the reflexivity that's going on because of the geopolitics and because of the fragile economy. And I think the combination of those two is actually creating greater volatility in the near term.
Other comments, questions?
Yeah, just a comment about those capital flows and talent flows exiting China. You see that in Russia, you see that in Venezuela. And this has been going on for decades, yeah? And it's accelerated at times like it is now in Russia. You're seeing that talent flow and that capital flow going out like we haven't seen since the early 90s. But nevertheless, that has been going on for decades now. And that I think that goes to this, also goes to this idea of China taking over the US as the largest economy. That's one of the challenges that the Chinese are always going to have. The people don't have a firm belief in the future there. You see that in Russia as well. Just a commentary.
It's also why the US needs to fix their immigration policy and fix it immediately. We have an opportunity to take some of the best and brightest from the world and bring them here and have them be productive members of our society. And we're trying not to do that. It's fascinating.
We were going to have a panel on that subject, Stephen, for tomorrow or the next day, but I got lost in the shuffle. We should make it its own deep dive. I think there'd be a consortium of like-minded. I think more people are in favor of it than against, although there's some other issues about illegal immigration, but. Kia, question.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question about this China situation that's happening. I was wondering if are we in that stage that we have to worry about the disruption that's happening with the manufacturing, such as Apple and other manufacturing companies? Because if this continues, if this protest continues, then some of the U.S. companies or other European companies have to pull out of China and go to neighboring countries. Are we in that situation yet, or we're far from that?
I'll start, Hamlet, you can go next, but I think we're not there yet, but companies are sitting there right now saying, how do I protect myself? How do I China-proof myself going forward? I think that's what they're doing. Hamlet?
Yeah. I'm a little more, I guess, hawkish in terms of where Xi is going with this. I think Xi's been preparing this action for the last several years. I think he's been bringing the oars in and trying to protect Chinese economy to a certain extent and decouple it from the rest of the West. Because I do think he eventually wants to form a separate trading bloc where China is the lead. And I think what we're seeing right now is the opening stages of that happening. So for companies that are still in China, that are Western, I think they're and you be paying attention to the door in terms of what happens when everything shuts down. But Bill, to your point, I think what we've seen is a reversal on Chinese policy. As critical as I've been on Chinese foreign policy in the past, especially from the US, I think actually was working to a certain extent where China was becoming modernized and was becoming kind of embedded into the global order. And I think what you saw from the emergence of Xi and how he and the party used corruption to consolidate power and really bring everyone under the top thumb of the CCP was the core Communist Party waking up probably about 10 years ago and realizing the country was beginning to modernize and stray away from the party. So I think this whole concept of globalization and bringing China into the fold, it could work in the long term, but I don't think it's going to work with the CCP. And I think we're starting to see just the beginnings of what that turbulence is going to look like.
Well, other comments, questions?
I mean, yeah, Hamlet, I agree with you, and it poses yet another question. If they're moving back towards a much stricter authoritarian state, how in the world are they ever going to get kind of the economic growth that they look for? I'm not saying that they're not.
Yeah.
It just seems like it's a downward spiral for them.
Well, it is if you think like the West, if you're thinking about a quarter or an election cycle or a year. I think China's got a much longer view on this one.
Yeah.
My personal opinion is they've done the math. There's 330 million people in the US. There's about 700 million people collectively when you factor in Western Europe, maybe about a billion too when you factor in like-minded, democratized Southeast Asia and the Pac Rim. India being a wild card, another 1.4 billion. There's still another 5 billion people out there. I think what they're betting on is the back half of the 21st century. The true economic growth isn't going to come from the developed world. It's going to come from the underdeveloped world that is going to grow into urban cities, modern cities, and become ingrained into the 21st century. The whole Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is their effort to start co-opting that world to follow the China model, because that's where the growth is going to come from. So them decoupling from the US, I think, is going to cause some pain in the near term. But China doesn't think about a quarter or a year or a cycle. They think decades ahead, and this is, I think, where they're going.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just worried about their own people, because if they put the squash on that, I mean, this is only the beginning, comrade.
Oh yeah, it is. It absolutely is. But I mean, that's how totalitarian regimes work, though, right? You hammer down and makes life so miserable at home that the people have one of two choices. They're either going to bend the knee and accept the norm, or they're going to flee. So if they flee, then you have less and less people that are going to resist, and you have more and more true believers, or the indoctrinated, or people who don't care. And that's potentially what China's working towards.
Yeah, they could make people more reliant on the state because of their economy weakening. That puts them in a tighter spot where they rely on the government more again. And
well, the scary thing there, though, is to that point, if you now indoctrinated the entire society to believe and rely on the state for its existence, then it becomes a lot easier to make anybody outside of the country a bad actor or an enemy. So a wag a dog scenario, or nationalizing that hatred towards your enemies, becomes the norm, which is not good.
the other thing that I would point out is that the COVID process that they're going through in China is actually putting the state much more intrusive into people's lives than they've been previously. And that in your apartment buildings on your floor, there's a party member that checks on you, that they have your phones. They're really becoming much more intrusive into people's lives. So a lot of the freedoms that came over the last 20 years have evaporated in the last 2 years. And I think that's a big change that people don't fully appreciate, is they're monitoring every movement that you have within 3 meters.
Yep.
Well, I know we're here to talk about Iran and 11:30, but just on that point of these blocks, how does Asia split up? And how do those who are neutral-ish position themselves?
I don't think there is going to be neutral. I think you're going to pick sides at this point. Going back to how the 80s worked, you generally had, if you're part of the Soviet bloc or you're part of the Western bloc, is generally how it worked if you're part of the developed world. And that's where China's going right now. And I think they're trying to embrace and bring the developed world under their umbrella. I mean, there's countless reports I've seen in terms of the Chinese courting foreign ministers and diplomats from the emerging economies, taking them to leadership institutes inside China and educating them on kind of the fallacies of failed Western democracies, and saying that our way is the right way. So they're seeding a whole future cadre of folks that are going to be wanting to be beholden to China. So that block, I think, is going to happen, or in China's eyes, it's going to happen. The big wild card there, though, I think is going to be India. India is never going to be an aligned Western superpower. They're never going to be kind of at the beck and call of the U.S. or the West, nor should they. I mean, they're the world's biggest democracy, and by population count bigger than China. I think India is always going to be unaligned, and they're always going to I think they're going to realize, and they probably have realized, that longer term they don't function as a vassal state of China. China's long-term best interest do not have India's best interest in hand. So I think this is where India is going to be the superpower, so to speak, that's going to get in the way of what Xi wants to create, which is this super block or superpower block that he controls.
So again, just pausing on Iran, and hi, Safa, by the way, welcome. Andrew Randak, can I ask you a question?
No, I don't want you to ask me any questions.
Well, maybe it depends on the question.
Yeah, exactly. What's the question? Maybe I'll let you know.
Well, how does Latin America line up with this?
Latin America is going to be, I'm wary of the block talk, because a lot of countries aren't, it's not in their regime's best interest to align themselves too closely with any one bloc or another, with obvious exceptions, like Australia, New Zealand with the US type of thing, or Japan with the US. But even Japan wants to do lots of business with China. And certainly Southeast Asia, they're going to lean US, but they want to do business all over the region. I think that the blocs are going to be sort of intertwined at the fringes, absolutely intertwined. And Latin America fits in with being a fringe, because it's economically not that important relative to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, I love Latin America, but it just never got its act together at the end of the day. And now it's even worse. Adam Tooze published a piece this morning or yesterday about that. I'll see if I can find it and circulate. Latin America it's becoming a backwater again. The growth of the last 10 years compares poorly to the growth of the 80s, which was a lost decade. Structural reform is going backwards, privatization is going backwards. So
that's a whole different topic. But
but I don't think they're going to align. But my point is, I don't think they're going to align with one or another. I think they're going to try to do business with everybody.
That was where I was coming from, him. I just
that's where, frankly, and that's where we should be. We shouldn't have two monolithic blocks. I think it should be just what's the right way to put this? A globalism with a nationalistic appeal, where you're welcome and free to be your own independent country, but we all find a way where we integrate and intertwine with each other. That's where we should be. I don't think that's where China wants to go. I think China wants to be the superpower. So to get there is to form their own bloc and take out the bloc that's in the way of that, which is the Western bloc.
Which is interesting when you think about it, Hamlet, that they're going to align with a block of countries that they're already going in knowing that China wants to be on top of them. Well,
That's the China model, though, right?
Yep.
Putin wants turf. Putin's an expansionist. Xi and China are not. What they want is they want to create a network of vassal states that kind of are beholden to the Chinese model, are run by a strong man or government that has absolute control and will follow and do the bidding of China.
which gets to the area you're going to get to next, but the protests in China and the protests in Iran, are they enough to take down the blocks? Is really I think one of the big questions.
I hope so. I hope so, because I think this whole concept of freedom and liberty has gotten out. Totalitarian regimes, authoritarian regimes do not last. Over time, people start realizing what they have and what they don't have. And once they realize they have a voice, that becomes pretty dangerous. This style of governance worked. Ruling society with an iron fist worked for 2,000 years because there was no democratization of information. Now that we're there, these strongmen can't do this anymore, and it's going to be an interesting battle that's going to shape up. I think Xi, I think Putin, I think the mullahs are going down this path where they're going to be in trouble. I think you're starting to see a certain bit of resistance from the inside, where people are like, no, we've had it, we're fed up, we don't want this anymore. We understand what we're missing out on, and we're gonna raise and rise up because we realize we have you outnumbered. It's a dangerous scenario because neither one of those regimes want that, and neither of those regimes, the people in them, will physically survive if that happens. So it's gonna be maybe fighting tooth and nail for this.
Seeing a little bit of pushback in Brazil too.
Yep.
But it's very difficult to convert that civil unrest to regime change. You have to have leader. You have to have a leader.
Correct.
And it has to come from inside that leader.
Correct.
So, that's really the big question. Who will lead it?
And don't
anyone.
forget the Arab Spring and how wonderful that turned out.
What's that? Sorry, say that again?
I said, don't forget the Arab Spring and how wonderful that turned out.
Exactly.
Well, Hamlet, how do you want to set the stage here? Well, we were looking just to make sense of latest developments.
Yeah.
There's been like this steady march that's not going away of protests. And, I think if there's any one regime change, to me, if something could happen in Iran, the spillover effect is amazing. But
No, it'll be massive. Yeah.
yeah, and by the way, meet your fellow Persian, Safa. I don't know if you guys have actually. Safa's on his way over here today.
Yeah. No, him and I chatted over the summer. How you doing, Safa?
Hey, how are you? Always enjoy your insights. Yeah, I'll actually be leaving in about 15 minutes. My Uber is coming to pick me up, so I'll see you guys in New York. But if I may, I wanted to comment because obviously the situation is very tense in Iran, and I obviously, Hamlet, I don't know if others are aware that today, especially with the game going on between US and Iran, is a very controversial period because many Iranians don't support their national team because they feel it is associated with the regime. I don't subscribe to that view. I think it's soccer. I like soccer. I like our team to win. But it has divided the country quite a bit, or energized it. I don't think division is the right word because I would say 95% are against their team. But I would say that I'm a little bit more cautious than what I heard Hamlet and others saying in terms of how soon things might change. This regime is incredibly versatile and is like a octopus with all its tentacles in every aspect of the government and the country. And besides, as you have noted before, there is no organized opposition. These are disorganized groups. It has clearly awakened something in people. So I think it is fairly safe to say it is the beginning of the end, but the end may not come until several years. Regarding China, I don't have the same optimism that this will be the beginning of anything. Chinese government is incredibly efficient. up to now, they hadn't really made many mistakes. The big mistake right now, which compounded for them, was the COVID issue. And obviously it got Xi in a tight spot. And there isn't an easy way out of that, because if they relax the restrictions, then they will have an exit wave and they have to deal with that. Possibly 1 million people die in China. Can they live with that or not? But that's a highly efficient society. Until recently, you wouldn't really have any anti-government sentiments because people were prosperous and doing well. And so I don't think the situations are comparable. I wish they were. I wish that this was the beginning of the end of the totalitarians, but I think more totalitarian regimes will learn from China to be how to be efficient and provide the basics for the people so that they don't mind in the short term lack of their liberties. At some point they would, as we have seen in South Korea and other countries in the past decades, that people say, okay, we have all the material needs. Now, like the West, we also want to have our liberties. But I don't think China is there yet. Iran certainly is a different situation, but again, it will take a few years.
I agree. I agree
So-
very much so. No, the situation in Iran is interesting. I think the beginning of the end is here, but the Iranian regime, it's the roots of the IRGC and kind of clerical establishment right now runs so deep. Although it makes up a small minority of that country, to purge those roots out, it's not going to happen overnight. I think what we're looking at now is probably a sustained period of these sporadic protests and pockets of resistance in Iran. I think you look to the next seminal event to be the catalyst of a change in dynamics in Iran, and that could be the death of Khamenei. He's in his mid to late 80s right now, alleged to have survived cancer, but in poor health. He's talked about putting his son to be the heir apparent once he passes. That is causing, I think, some agita and some resentments just within the clerical and the IRGC leadership that's there. People either want that to happen, want their own dog in the race, or want some sort of a council set up versus a supreme leader. And then obviously you have the entire rest of the country, which is a large majority, that does not want the clerical regime to last. So if I had a handicap, what's the next escalation point? I think it would be that. It would be some sort of a geopolitical shock or event that causes that. And I think realistically, that's probably somewhere on the near-term horizon. Now, whether that leads to immediate regime change, that's too hard to predict in terms of how it's going to happen. I just know I know Iran's not going to go down without a fight. Yeah,
I see three scenarios, Hamlet, and I would love to hear your thoughts on these for Iran in the next, say, 12 to 24 months. One is that, as you said, with Khamenei's, that there would be some changes going on. And I would put that in the camp of also potentially some people within IRGC doing an internal coup and changing the regime slightly, taking actually a harder line, but also on the surface showing that this is a different regime now. We don't have the Khamenei power in there. So I think that might quell some of the unrest, just because there would be a complete changeover. There'll be obviously show of force, but they would also, if they're smart, go back and relax some of the restrictions and try to get some of the economic pressure off. The second would be that Iran would start some sort of geopolitical unrest to divert the attention and organize people. In fact, I think to a smaller extent, the World Cup could have been that, because I think one of the rationale that people have that they don't want to support a team is that they don't want to show the solidarity with all the people in one occasion. But I think it's possible that they could make an attack. And I think the reason they are announcing that they have increased enrichment of uranium is basically because they want to almost engage the West and Israel in some sort of a conflict, because if there is a conflict, if Israel hits Iran, I don't think many people would say we're with Israel. So they would have to defend the country anyway. So I think that's the second scenario, that Iran could start something. And the third one is that, these things are broad and people are really fed up, and it's deep, but it could die down. I mean, the country is still functioning, so they could just hang on and relax things a little bit, not try not to have much violence, limit the killings. And after a while, I think people will run out of the reasons to go out, and it is possible that it will continue, but it won't continue on a wave that could be dangerous for them. So those are the three scenarios that I see, but I would love to see what you think, Helmut.
Yeah, no, well, great points. Just to put the history of revolution in context for Iran. The Iranian revolution was in 1979. I was actually born in Iran, so we fled about 2 months after the fall of the embassy. So I remember life before and after the revolution. But since then, and what brought the mullahs to power, thinking back in '79, the populace was not happy with the Shah and wanted change. They wanted a fresh face. They wanted a voice. So you had the Shah deposed. At that time, the only two power centers that were really in power and were able to kind of coalesce and organize were the Marxists, MEK, and Khomeini and the clerics. Those two power centers very quickly grabbed the reins of power, and the clerics very quickly pushed the secular, the Marxists out, and took over absolute control. So the whole country, when they forced the Shah out in '79, they didn't in unison raise their hand and say, we want to be now ruled by a theocracy. The theocracy happened to be the only power that was really organized and able to kind of coalesce and step in and run the country. Since 1979, you've seen, in my opinion, a very steady and now increasing secularization of Iran. Iranians, by large majority, are Shia, but I would like them to think that they're not as religious from a practicing standpoint. No different than the U.S. Majority of the U.S. is Christian, but not everyone's going to church every Sunday and praying and following the teachings of God on a detailed basis. I think Iran is going down that path as well. If you look at the tenor of the demonstrations and the rebellions inside Iran, what you're seeing is a trend. And I think what this is going to plot out is going to be a significant escalation in that trend. So even if things do die down, as Safa mentioned, which I think is a possibility, the long-term trend, I think, is regime change. In 1999 is when you had some of the first real bits of uprising inside Iran. There were a series of protests in Tabriz in the northwest provinces, which is heavily Azeri. The regime was very quick to put those down. You had a handful of deaths. But it's kind of the real first kind of uprisings inside Iran. After that brought to power Khatami, who was a cleric, but claimed himself to be a reformist as a president. This is in the mid-2000s. Khatami lost to Ahmadinejad, and a lot of people speculate that Ahmadinejad was really kind of the IRGC's man in the White House, or man inside government. And that's when the IRGC really began to take over the realms of the Iranian economy, not only the military industrial complex, but the energy complex as well. Fast forward to 2009, you had the Iranian Green Revolution, a significant escalation in terms of violence and protests and demonstrations, dwarfed what was happening in 1999. And then at that point, I think you had a couple hundred deaths, wide amounts of protests, significant amount of arrests. And this is when I think the regime began to really start clamping down around reform and around reformists. You have the protests that happened in 2008, 2019, that culminated in Bloody November, where hundreds, if not thousands, of Iranians were killed in these protests. And I think what that happened with that, everyone looked at it, is this now going to be the time for regime change? You have the potential elections with Rouhani around the corner. That didn't happen. Rouhani was summarily moved off the stage, and then came Raisi, who is an absolute hardliner. And so here we are in 2022, where by some estimations, you've got several thousand deaths, you have 15,000 arrested. And I think the tenor and tone of these protests is going to continue. Now, whether this leads to a slow regime change, or whether we're going to push out another 4, 5, 7 years, that's anybody's guess at this point. But one interesting quote, Khatami is a cleric. He claims himself to be a reformist. He was president of Iran in the early 2000s. He was quoted in an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that these regimes these protests aren't sporadic. They're not just on the fringes. And if Iran doesn't get a handle on what's going on, they're heading towards full systemic collapse. It's a pretty powerful statement coming from a former president of the country. So just to understand where the dynamics lie inside Iran, you have two power centers or spheres of influence, actually three inside Iran. You have the military industrial complex, which is the IRGC. You have the clerics, which are the mullahs, and then you have the Bazari class, which are the traders and the businessmen. The Bazaris have been pretty much marginalized since 1999 to mid 2000s. They used to be one of the main power centers inside Iran. The IRGC played a big part in doing that. So you really have now two power centers inside Iran: the IRGC military industrial energy complex and the true hardline clerics. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, was set up by Khomeini after he took power. Their job was to be the Praetorian Guard of the regime, not the country, but the regime. And they've been very effective over the years in protecting the regime, but also exporting the regime's goals abroad. So when you hear IRGC being linked to terrorism, that's not supposition, that's fact. There's been countless cases where IRGC operations have been tied to terrorist attacks outside of Iran against U.S. and Western Israeli interests. So what's happened, I think, since 2009 is the two small power centers that are in control of Iran, the clerics and the hardliners, have beginning to almost get into a bit of a turf war in power. Those two power centers, in my opinion, represent less than 20% of the Iranian populace. Half of the people want the Islamic Republic, or half of this small minority wants the Islamic Republic to stay in power for ideological reasons. They're true believers of the Shia faith, but more importantly, they're true believers of Mahdiism, which is a very distinct different from being a regular Shia. And then you have the power base that potentially came from the clerical establishment, but they're absolute corrupt. They're kleptocracy, and they realize that they're in charge of a 75 million person economy based on fossil fuels. So they don't want to lose power because they see what happens in the Middle East when you get deposed. Not only do you use power and wealth, in many cases you're dead. So what you've seen, I think, is a power struggle between those two, where they wanted it to not necessarily modernize, but they wanted to tone down the political dogma in fear of either Israeli or foreign action, or dust up or rising up of the people from inside Iran. So if there's going to be any kind of regime change, everyone says, well, who's the leader? Who's it going to be? If it is going to be organic, I think it potentially would be an element within one of those power centers out of self-preservation, realizing that if we don't do something now, we're out of power and we're dead. What we can do now, and Safa references, is we can sell out the clerics, we can sell out the mullahs, we can cut some sort of an accord with the people where us as a kleptocracy, us as oligarchs are now going to be in charge of Iran, full stop. But as a trade to the people, we're going to modernize. We're going to open up society. We're going to open up to Western culture and music and rock and roll and whatnot, and hope that buys them relief and buys them the ability to control Iran.